But let's get into it. It's I just hit record, so we're going now. The point of today is again just a general. I'm sure you have lots of questions about assignment 3. We can go through them. We can do demos. There's lots of things about assignment 3 I can't show you. Like if you ask, I want you to show me how to solve this particular problem, I could maybe show you some segments or just talk to it. And if you have questions about, how do we use React Router or something like that, then I can help out with that. So yeah, let's go. Do you just want to share some questions on the chat? That'd be the best way to start. Just give me 1 sec while you do that. I'm sure some of you will have something. I know there's a lot of people who haven't quite started assignment 3 yet, or I've seen some people kind of emailing me today being like, oh, I'm thinking about starting it, or things like that. Cool, that's good. Vedant said that watched all the content and gets it generally. Hasn't started. Yep. One thing you did in assignment 2 was just lost the window. Yeah, so that's a good question. I actually can't remember how much between the tutorials and the lectures, I know it's been there. I might have talked about it in my tutorials. I generally recommend, I think my week 5, 7, and 8 tutorials have been quite interesting. I think week 5 was maybe the fetch stuff and lots on fetch, and week 7 and 8 was a little bit on React. So I'd definitely check those out. What I would say is that for assignment 3, the general approach I'd encourage again from, I don't know if it was my lecture or my tute, is just having a pages and a components folder. So again, the classic thing, like a simple approach would be that your app.jsx would probably house your router essentially and the key pages. So on your app, you're probably going to have a series of routes. You're going to have, maybe let's look at the spec. You're going to have a route that's probably to do with register, login. I could just search unique route really. You'll have one for register, login, a dashboard, an edit game, a edit game question, results, join. You might have more than that, but it's like, and then you have for the people playing the game, right? And for the people playing a game, they only seem to have one route. So even if you do these or you do more, you're looking at less than 10 routes. So essentially, if I was doing this, my app.jsx would consist of those routes, like those 8 or 10 routes. And maybe you don't need a nav bar or something because it's a bit more complex than a website. It's kind of like a game. But all of those routes would essentially just load up components that I've written inside the pages folder, right? And inside the pages folder, those components would just be like normal components. Then we can do one here. And then any components that any of those pages use go in the components folder. So the way I guess I think about it is like, React's app.jsx and a series of components that it composes. And all of those components go inside the components folder. And if one of those components is a top level component, i.e. it is the highest component inside of like a route tag, then it goes inside pages. And that just makes it easier for people when they're looking at this to be like, here's a starting point. Because otherwise it's just a big bag of components. And like, as an example here, we should probably really run this because we might be working with it. This is what we did last week, isn't it? Good. So I'll get this up. So let's, for instance, try and pull that out into a separate component, because I know that most of the time in lectures we keep things in one component just because it's simpler, right? Like it's nice and simple to keep things in one component. So what I would do in that case is I would it's already in that TypeScript React. That's good. I would take my whole component here, home, and I will pull it out and I will put it inside a folder inside of pages, and I will call this folder home.jsx, like that, and then I'll put it in here. Now, all component files have a pretty common format, which is that they're simply just a function that is export defaulted. So that's a component, but obviously this will rely on some imports that exist up here. I don't know what ones. I will need the React import, prop types. I think we used that. No, we didn't use that for home, apparently, because there's no props for home. Okay, so we don't need that one. Do we use browser router, switch, route, no, or link? None of those use React router DOM. So that's as simple as your component is. So now when I save that in my app.jsx, instead of like having home as something I define here, I would say import home from pages/home, like that. And now when I load up my app, hello? Where is it? This is the right app, isn't it? I don't know. /about. What have I done wrong? Why is nothing loading? I'm dubious that I don't know why I'm not getting an error. I don't know why I'm not getting anything. This is kind of scary. You need to enable JavaScript to run this app. What? I don't know. It's not working in Firefox either. I'm confused. I don't know what I've done today. So weird. I like debugging with you all because it helps you realize how stupid I am. I don't understand what's happening. Am I even running the right app? No, I'm not running the right app. Classic problem. It's a bit complicated with the way we do the core stuff. There's like, I've like cloned this to a repo and then I've cloned it to a master repo that's made of submodules, and I get them confused sometimes when I lecture. Sorry about that. This should work now. I can undo this. We'll just wait for this to load quickly. Also, just as a heads up, some groups last term had this issue where like when they yarn installed something for their front end and it like broke the back end. If you run into that problem, What's really helpful is that you could actually just clone the second repo to run the backend. Like you could have two repos running concurrently. They don't need to be the same repo. But let's see this. Let's see this one load. Okay, can't resolve pages / home. This is to do with the fact that unless you have a more advanced setup, you do actually need to define these in a relative sense. And now I'm getting some of your classic linting errors like line 45, empty space, email inputs not defined on 37 of home. It's because I use these inside of home. So now what I would do is, because I use this email component, I would make, because remember how in our home.jsx from last week, we had our email component here that uses prop types. Great. Oh, leave me alone. Okay, remember this, right? We had a couple emails, you click add, you add more emails like this. We had an email input component that we used to wrap this, so we had a nice little abstraction here, right? For something like this, what I would then do is I would take this and I would make a new file in my components folder, and I would call it email input.jsx. And this would be an export default whatever, and I would use the prop types here like that. So now I have my home page, my email component, and I would have to import it too. So import email input from dot components. You can read what I'm writing, / email input like this. Okay, that would be a fairly standard way to structure a React app. And you could take that as far as you want. You could sub-folder components if you want. I would generally say that given the size of your project, that's probably overkill. Like good naming will do that for you, you know. So you should be fine there. Just to loop back to the questions. Yeah, so Vishal asked, how can we transfer app to go from one page to another? I think we covered that. At the very least, I covered that in the lecture, and then I think last week, and I think I covered it in my Tute this week too. So you can go look at the recording for Tute 8 if you're interested in like having different routes and moving between those pages. So it's pretty straightforward. Oh, you said you've watched that, sorry. I've watched router lectures, but do we have to include those router links on all JS files or just the main one? You don't have to include them anywhere. They only exist to actually move you between pages. So you only would deal with these when you want to move between pages. And again, you can check out my Tute 8 on this. And if we're in one of the components and we click a button, which command we can use to transfer to another page? Again, so one thing I did talk about in Tute 8, which I'm just pointing you all to, is we did talk about how to link people without a button. So like right here, this is easy to link them because it's like a button, but we talked about how to like asynchronously link someone, which was like an interesting little thing where I'll just quickly demo it, but I'm not going to go through it in a ton of detail because we did talk about it before, which is like, let's say you want to trigger it programmatically. That's what we'd say, right? Like you don't want to do it with these like HTML, JSX tags. You want to just like make it happen with code. Maybe I'll have in my about thing, I'll have like a ready to go, set ready to go, just like a Boolean that starts as false. And I'll have in my H2, I'll have that, and then I'll also have a, I don't know, just a random div. Go. And when someone clicks on that div, I want to set ready to go to be true, like that. So now if we console log ready to go, React will handle the state change. We can look at this in the console. Block must be padded by blank lines. Okay. Actually, is that what it even is asking for? No, it's not. Okay. Yeah, so this div here, I click that and you see it goes to true, right? So it does that. But if I want to redirect programmatically, what I actually do in these scenarios is instead of saying something like, redirect to whatever, I actually return a redirect component to a particular URL, which in this case might be home. And it's a little bit strange, but this is actually a JSX component that you can import here. And the way this one, it's from React Router DOM. And all this component does is you're basically sending a render command to the screen that's like, hey, render this, but I'm just kidding. I actually want you to redirect, thanks. So like, you do that, and then when I'm on about now, when I click go, the state's updated, it refreshes, this if statement's entered, and then instead of following through and returning the normal thing, it has an early return for a component, and this component will trigger the redirect like that. So that's how you can do things programmatically. Maja, for smaller components like buttons, should they have an accompanying CSS file, or is it okay to define the style in the JSX file? I don't know if we have a clear ruling on that. What I'd say is that in general, the lectures do say that you're better off using styled components instead of .css files, because I think .css files, the way they actually work is they just get transpiled directly, they just get dumped somewhere in the global scope. So .css files can be tricky, whereas if you use styled components, you're kind of bounding its scope a little better. And for styled components, I think the general way that styled components would work, I can have a look at what some of my employees do at work at the moment, maybe. I don't know, I haven't really looked at their front-end code in a while. Yeah, so this is a common thing that you'll see happen, right? Is here's a React file with lots of tags and stuff, and then they'll have particular styles probably, or padding here is a style. I don't think there's any class names here, but style, whatever. But the actual styles are defined in an adjacent file, just like the .css files are, except they're actual JavaScript files. And in this case, they have style components. And then the JSX file will import that style component file, which is just a way of actually defining styles. It has a very similar format to CSS. So that's definitely the approach I would recommend, because it's good practice and it's clean and easy to use that way. Remember, this is a JavaScript file, not a CSS file. So if you were using this in your project, in you made a style component for this one, then I would probably end up calling the file email input.styles.js. Yeah, so email input.styles.js or something like that. You could also just call it email input. I think that's a good practice. And then you'd import that into the file. So I would say import, what are these two things here? Import these two things from /email input.styles. That would be the standard approach. And then when you're actually making components, you could say class. I don't remember how to do this off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I don't use style components much, but you would inject it into that styled div. Yeah, that's pretty much the approach there. You could also, I guess, have a giant styled components file. That's probably okay, but depends how big it is, right? And it's probably going to get pretty big pretty quick. The other cool thing about style components is it handles inheritance pretty well. So for something like this, if you have a standard button, you can define that standard button in a more common place. So in my project, I might also have another folder inside a source called I don't know, styles, literally, or something, and I put all like common or something where I put like all my standard styles that are used throughout the entire app. Because obviously you don't want to do repetition. All of the styles defined in particular JSX files or in the paired files here should be pretty much directly related to the task at hand, which is the component that you're dealing with. Patrick says, do we need to use useEffect to wrap it around? I don't think you would need to use useEffect in this scenario we were looking at here in app.jsx. No. useEffect is... The most common use case for useEffect for you all would be, again, something you want to happen on load, which for the bulk of the time for you is going to be when you do a fetch. I need to get all the I need to get all the quiz questions. I need to do all of that. You can fake useEffect, by the way, really easily. Like I'll show you. Like if you want something to run once, you just do this. You just say you know, done, set done. Set it as false. If it's not done, console log do. Set done true. Right, like fairly standard programming logic. You could imagine that in a while loop. Oh no. I broke it. But yeah, I mean, that's what a useEffect with an empty capture does. It pretty much just... It does... You could do that. That's the same approach. Just a little less elegant. Devansh says, can you tell me the difference between .js and .jsx? So, .jsx is a JavaScript file, except typically you label it that if it includes JSX components. It doesn't have any real major practical benefit, except that it makes it clearer to someone like what is just a JavaScript file that's interpreted by Node, and what is a JSX file that's actually using particular JSX language. And typically a JSX file will imply that there's some kind of front-end aspect to it, whereas like sometimes a JS file, like if you think back to assignment 2, a JS file might just consist of things that are just literally JavaScript. Like all of this is just JavaScript. I mean, it's not that simple, not that one, but you get my point. Yeah. Yeah, JSX is essentially a naming convention. I think it gets a little bit more complicated in the sense that some linters and interpreters might expect it, but it's entirely constructed is what I'd say. Like it's entirely constructed as a programming behavior. It's not like baked into the compiler or anything like that. I still don't quite know what you mean, Patrick, about the using effect to listen to the change of ready to go. Like I'm sure you could add code there for it, I just don't know if it would achieve anything that you can't already do, if that makes sense. And again, usually the use cases of useEffect are either A, running something once, or B, running something every time a particular state or set of state variables updates, but not everything. Because by default, everything you write into your functional component will be triggered every single time there's a state update. Well, if the ready to go changes, it automatically auto triggers because, again, like everything in a functional component will be re-triggered every time one of the state variable changes. useEffect is not about adding that functionality. useEffect is often about restricting it to certain scenarios, like first load or only certain variables. Use effect is a restrictive tool, right? It's about clawing it back, making it happen less. Okay, another quick one. I've seen a forum post regarding including the same structure API from assignment API.js and was wondering if we leave it as pure vanilla JavaScript or we convert it to fit React somehow. That's a great question. So it's important to understand that React is basically just JSX in a lot of ways. It's a programming pattern that, you know, defines components and files and this and that that are rendered on the screen. And React can use JavaScript, so you don't really need to refit anything or translate anything. It's just React uses it. So, like, to give you an example, we have and again, I'm talking about work stuff here. I have to find the damn thing. I think it's in, what's it in? Common. So like a component I wrote a very long time ago, which I can't even find anymore. Yeah. I wrote a calculator to help people figure out when they can retire. And it, you know, it kind of looked very Reacty, right? You can see it. There's JSX, looks like HTML attributes, just JavaScript, HTML, mixy. But this, and you know, there's some, you know, use states and there's use effects and, but all of this relied on a set of logic, basically a logic engine here called retirement estimator, or RE. And this was defined in this file here, which it's not opening for me, but, and this was written by me as well, a while ago now, nearly 2 years. And this is all JavaScript. In fact, I think basically all of this would run in the web browser, because remember again, you have like core JavaScript, which is basically what that first JavaScript lecture is about. And then when you take that and you put it in the browser, there's some extra browser features like local storage. And when you put that in Node.js in the terminal, there's some extra things like importing and using style components and file system. And then React.js, which is the tricky part, is an extension of that Node.js part that gives you all these features. So you're basically writing like Node.js++ that transpiles into web stuff, which is like a little bit weird. So, you know, you can use vanilla JavaScript, you can use Node stuff, whatever, React. It'll all transpile together for something that's pluggable on the web. Hongtao says, is React only for single page applications? Most modern declarative frameworks are for single page applications because that's most of the way that people interact with the web, right? So that's why they're that way. They're not like a boutique thing. It's just like most things you work with are single page apps now, right? I'm sure YouTube, Facebook, God knows what else are mostly like that. That being said, sometimes we don't like things about single page apps. And one main thing we don't like about single page apps again is like I've gone and made this beautiful page here, right? This beautiful page. I love it. And you can see here, you know, I've got all my HTML and it's all here and stuff like this. But one problem with single page apps is when I open the source code, notice that nothing's here. See how this div ID root's not there? Like it's empty? Whereas in my inspector. So the elements inspector in your browser is something that happens in like real time. Your source code is what the browser initially loads. And a common problem with this is that the way that internet web scrapers work is that when they load your website, they'll load a particular URL, but they will not wait for all the JavaScript to update all the DOM elements. They'll pretty much render what you're given as a response to the server. So they'll render this. They're not going to go into all your JavaScript and execute it like you will with your browser. They will just render that. For that reason, there's a whole bunch of applications that are supersets of React, as in they build on top of React, right there, that help solve some of these problems. We don't talk about them in the course. I think a tutor, Daniel, is going to do a lecture, or is going to record a lecture for everyone. And one of the topics he mentioned was on this, so I might not go into it in too much detail, but one example is that there's a framework called Next.js, or Next.js, which is essentially a React framework, so it's built in React. But what it does is it actually like pre-renders pages on the server. So what you actually get left with is a page that actually looks built out, right? Like you actually have all the content on the page like you would your assignment 2 style page, even though that was a single page app. But you know what I mean, like your assignment 1 style page. So React in general is used for single page apps, but there are React-like products out there, or supersets, that can solve problems that come from the limitations of single page apps. Great. Okay, question. In 2.2.2, to delete a particular question, does it mean I need to update the game with a particular question deleted? Exactly. You don't, like, the way that the API works with this is that you just have to think about it, that every time you update a quiz, you give it all of the questions as if it's never seen them before, and it updates them to that. So if you have 20 questions and someone modifies the 5th question, you give them all 20 questions as if they've never seen it before, including the updated 5th one. And if you want to delete one, then you give it 19 questions as if it's never seen them before, so that 20th question just disappears. That's how the API is structured. Why is it structured like that? 3 reasons. It makes your life a little bit more interesting, which is my job. It's easier for me to build the back end, which is a second plus for me. And the third one is that it's not uncommon to actually have to do this sometimes. Every API you work with is kind of a bit weird sometimes. So sometimes it's good to give you guys something that's a little bit weird and requires you to do a little bit of management yourself. Because trust me, most APIs have things in it that you're like, God damn it, I wish I didn't have to do that. I'm getting to your question, Meg. Hongtao, how can we customize CSS style when using templates, for example, template and material UI? Like, I'll be honest with you, I've used template libraries very little for React, but I do know for a fact that things like material UI and React allow you to expand or modify things with style components. And a quick Google should lead you there. I looked at it, I think, because I recorded a lecture in T3. Benjamin looks young. Good old Benjamin. Yeah, so I think it's a little bit more weird. And I just don't know is the short answer. I just know it's doable. Like, this is the example I wanted. Like, if you have a look at this thing here, for instance, I mean, style components is very powerful because it basically takes a React component and wraps it, right? It's kind of like a bit of a decorator pattern. In this case here, sorry, they're using style components, but instead of just using a div or something. They're actually using a Material UI button that's being imported. So Material UI button, great. You're actually able to leverage this button, which is why you're using the framework, except now you can tweak it a little bit for this particular use case. But yes, short answer is you're going to have to do reading. Sadly, the way that pretty much all programming works is the more powerful your tool is, the more reading you'll do and the less writing you'll do. And the same is kind of true for something like Material UI and style components. Meg's question, could you show us a simple example of how to run our tests using yarn test? Okay, so by default, if you have your front end, let's just load it up again in another terminal. And you just go yarn test, what happens? Well, we can figure that out. I run yarn test, and it will call React scripts test -- watch all equals false. What the hell does that mean? What that means is that it will scour your repository to look for any component or to any file that follows the pattern .test.jsx. There's actually one that's given to you with the React app by default. For other examples, you will just have to go watch the lectures on it, because there are lectures on this. I think it's the component testing lecture. I think I did that one because Canva was busy. And they'll be a bit different to the basic React one, but they all follow the same pattern, which is that there's a test that does something, and you're asserting things. And in this case, they're looking for a component that has learn React in it, and it expects that component to be in the document. So, for instance, if I might have to do something here, like say learn React, see if this makes me pass the test. Hope you're all having a fabulous week, by the way. We passed. Great. So you'll be writing component tests. Again, if you're in a group, there's 6. If you're individual, it's 3. And you'll basically just be writing them next to the component files themselves. Yeah, that's all there is to that, really. And I mean, like, I know the examples are just in the lecture, so I'm just not going to double down on them now. I mean, we could maybe talk through them next week. I guess one thing I will just flag, though, about component testing is, like, let's find it in the lectures. Hopefully it's in the code. Hopefully I shared it. Hope I did somewhere. I might have to go find that after the lecture. Anyway, you could probably just look it up real quick. Testing, component testing. Live? Oh. That's a mistake, sorry. It's already been recorded. Yep, and then there's some examples. Great. So the examples that we go through, I think, in the testing lecture. Yeah, look at that weirdo. Great. So I'm just going to look at this for a sec. Oh, wait. Oh, my. That's good. My face is covering up my face. This couldn't be better. So there's code like this that you'll see in the lecture and we talk about, where you basically like often like this is a slightly different testing pattern, but they're all pretty similar. And the idea here being, you typically will find a component and assert the parts of that component are true, that it has this property, that it does this, that it's been clicked, and all of that. The concepts of it are actually very straightforward to test components. That's the easy part of testing. The hard part is that you're all going to sit down, a little bit like maybe when you first found linked lists or something and someone said write a solution, and you're like, well, if you gave me a solution, I'd understand it, but I don't know how to write one. I don't know how to produce something for you. And honestly, it's not easy, and that's okay. And like what most of you are going to do is spend some time trawling around the shallow rendering docs of Enzyme, and like looking at examples here and looking at all these different selectors and thinking about what you could, or use to demonstrate it. So yeah, just my advice just generally is go into it knowing that you're not going to get to a point where you feel like you're just like, oh, I'll just write some code now. It's going to feel a little bit like I have to really think about what I'm going to put here and find the right function. Ooh, okay. She says, can you explain a little bit on how a child component might change states that are managed by its parent component by passing down both the states and the functions to the states? That's a great question. Let's do that one. Let's take a 5-minute break first, though. My throat's about to jump out of my mouth, and I'm going to go check on my kitchen. So let's chat in 5, then we'll keep going. Hey, welcome back. I'm trying really hard to be energetic to compensate for my lack of energeticness. Okay, let's make some components and let's pass some props down. It is Bianco Hills. Bianco, I don't know, something. Hey, we already do this. Oh, that's good. I can actually answer your question with something we already have. Yeah, because we did it last week. Good. Might not have been obvious, but that's okay. So we actually did this here a bit. I'm going to have to split this up in a way. Alright, let's have a look at our home component. Remember that this consists of an update email function. Now this update email function is called every single time someone types in one of these inputs. So what you basically have in a literal sense is like you basically have a component here like home and then it's got some components down here which are basically email inputs. Email input 1 and like email input 2. Like this. And the problem is that you've got your state. Up here. But you want the action to update it to be done in the actual components, right? Also, the actual email inputs are up there, so it's like your components need to render them as well. You know, it's like each of these components actually needs to show the email. And this gets challenging, right? So you have to, like, the way you then work in this case is that you pass both the state variable and the function. I don't know why I'm using a $sign for variable. Probably because I learned PHP a long time ago. You pass that into each component, which is what we're doing here. So on this page, I have an email input, and then we're kind of looping through it. Right, we're displaying as many as exist. But each time we render one, we're giving it two important variables, which is update email, which is a function, and we're giving it the entire email inputs state variable. So literally all 6 of these inputs are actually getting all 6 emails in this case. You could clean that up if you wanted to, right? Like, we could change this to only pass in the relevant one, I think. Probably. So it just, displays email value like that. That would probably be fine too. Oops. Oh god. Yeah, so like this would still work here. But the point is that in all these cases we're passing these down to the components, and then it's actually the components on change and stuff that are triggering it. So the components are rendering the value that was passed into them, into those field inputs, and on change it's calling a function that was passed into it as well. So when you call set email, you're calling the function that was passed in, which is the update email function. So your parent component's actually like giving the child, the method to call. And that's kind of a common way that you'll pass state down. Like that's like a standard way that you manage broad state, is like if you have like, say, 2 components with a series of children and they all need to use the same state, maybe questions from a quiz is a great example, you'll typically try and do the fetch for questions in like the uppermost state, maybe even the page component. Fetch that, store it in a state stored in the page component, and then simply pass both the value and the set function down through props like that. Does that give some insight into that question? Okay, that's good. What other questions do people have? Again, I assume you'd run out of questions by 7:30, so don't feel under any pressure, but do you have any other questions of things we want to run through for assignment 3? I guess just while you're pondering, so next week, the first hour will probably be a guest lecture from Zane, who's from Google, on Fetch, I think, and some interesting graph stuff. I can't remember. He just talks. He does some demos. The second hour of next week will be more of us talking about assignment 3 and stuff. I know it feels like maybe you're like, oh, we're not learning stuff, but it's we actually push really hard at the start of the course to like get it all into you. You're really like, get it in, because you need a lot of it, right? Like, it's very hard to do some of these things without a broad base of knowledge, right? Like React's a great example. If you don't understand use state, use effect, React router, style components, what React even is, fetch. Like if you don't understand all that, it's really hard to do much with assignment 3. So kind of after week 7, a lot of the live lectures die off. I mean, you'll also see, like, as of next week, most of even the pre-recorded die off a bit. She says, thanks, but what if, say I have 42 intermediate components between where a state is managed and where it can be changed? You will never have 42 intermediate components, I guess, is the first place to start. But let's use a realistic number that's you might run into in a bad case, which is like 6 to 10. Right, that's pretty wild. I don't know if I've ever built a page that's 6 to 10 components deep. If you're just using, like, you know, you have to picture a React app like a tree, you know, because that's what it is. It's a giant tree. You got, you know, this component, and then there's a few in here, and then there's a few down here. And, like, yes, you might be reusing components, but for all intents and purposes, let's just imagine if you're reusing components, it's 2 separate components, right? Now, when you use React.useState, you're essentially saying, I'm going to manage the state of this component, or this component, or this component separately. When you want things to share state, now you start looking into either passing values down through props, or using something like use context or local storage to store it globally, right? So if you're getting into that 6 to 10, where like all 6 to 10 components or something, they all need it, then you kind of, you know, getting into that territory. Now the first question is, if say this component uses something and this component uses something, and that's it, you've probably designed it a bit poorly. Like I'd really question why like this component here really needs something that literally nothing else in the tree needs. Because typically, you know, you might kind of have quite a few components that need something. Like questions is a good example. And in that case, I'd either encourage you to say, maybe we should, you know, move the where this is used up, or even in here. Or alternatively, we should just do the fetch down here, because a lot of the state comes from a fetch or something like that. More likely, though, when you're dealing with state across multiple components, you're going to get 2 cases. One is when it kind of just looks like this, where it's just like lots of different things need it, and it's all random, and it's in a lot of places. And in this case, this might be like storing their authorization token. It's probably the main thing. And in this case, you kind of would look at local storage or use context or cookies or something of that sort, right? You just like, screw it, slap it on the browser, slap it nice and wide, super ugly, anti-pattern, but it's easy to use and better than just like propping the hell out of everything. But the more likely case you'll actually see is when you find that all of these components actually need it. And you realize that they're all kind of in a tree together. And again, the good case for this one is (2.2) and 2.3. Right. All of the editing of a big brain game and the questions, most components inside that will be interested in all of the question data. So in that case, I would never store that question data and use context or anything like that, even though it might be a little easier, because it's just not a good pattern. Because most of the time, if you're in the admin panel, if you're looking at past results, or if you're logging in or logging out or registering or any of that stuff, it doesn't care about it. So in this case, if there's, you know, 4 or 5 components deep, I'll just still pass it through props, because it's, you know, it's very narrow. Like, but the other thing is, like, when we say like pass things through props, what I did here, and just to paint this as an anti-example, do you remember how I changed this before? How previously, oh, Jesus, previously we did this, right? We had an email input state in our top component home, and then we passed that whole state to all of the children components used there. And then to print the value, we used the index, which we also passed in. Generally speaking, this is bad design. It's bad design because your component is requiring to be aware of more information than pertains to its existence, right? Like, you have to be philosophical about this. A component has a job, has a purpose. It should not do anything beyond that purpose, and it should live up to that purpose, right? So this email input here, its purpose is to display an email input, trigger a change, make some nice somethings, like, you know, make it look pretty, and that's it. It shouldn't have to be concerned about what all of the other emails are or what index it is in the list. This is also how you can feel like you're passing big things everywhere, because you don't need to pass big things everywhere, you know? It's like if you start with if you do a fetch where you get all the questions in the quiz, and then you have 10 questions on the sidebar, you don't need to pass all the question data to all of those 10 components, right? You can pass some of that question data to all of the 10 components. And I'll show you here how we can use JavaScript to make this even more general. And this would generally be considered good design, in my opinion. So I got all these email inputs here, right? But the thing is, I don't want this email input to have to be concerned with the index. It shouldn't be concerned with its location in the list. That's not its job. So, well, an easy thing to do. We do what we did before. We make email value the actual specific value in the list. We don't give it the whole list and index it out. Now that's good, sure, that works. But it's... Oop. What have I done? Didn't save it. Okay. Yep. Done. Great. But the index. Well, when do we use the index? We use it in 2 locations. Okay, well, it's easy to get rid of this first one, because we could just give this email input a title now. Or a title. So now instead of doing this, I can just say, you know what, we're just going to print a title. Well, actually, I still need index, sorry. So now we add a title here. Title prop types dot string. And then the title I'm going to give it is going to be email IDX +1. Like that. Right, because think about it. Who's interested in where that is in the list? It's not the email input component. It doesn't care. That's not its purpose. The purpose of like visually communicating where something is in a list is the component that's responsible for organizing it, which is the parent. So moving this title here is good design, again, in my view. Right, you're trying to, you know, reduce that. The next one is harder to remove. How do we remove the index here? Well, you know, you think, well, I could try and abstract the function. I could say that set email, well, what it actually does is, well, I mean, I could do this here, right? Where I say that I'm going to give it a function that takes in an E, and it calls update email, and it gives it the index and e.target.value. So now the set email, I'm just going to literally give it to that, right? Like I've basically moved that up a layer. And this should still work. Nah, it doesn't. Why not? Didn't save the other file this time. Alright, let's try this. Okay. This works fine now. So what's cool is we've totally abstracted this so we can get rid of index. There's no need to be aware of the index. Beautiful. Downside though, we have coupled this in the opposite direction, whereby now this component is not aware what the onChange does. So in theory, the component should be in control of the value it provides to the setEmail function, right? I hope that makes sense. It's like, right now what happens is it's like, hey input, give us your event. Like basically what we're saying is, given the event, call setEmail with the event. That's literally what just putting this here does. Right, this is a pointless wrapper. We've turned a function setEmail into, like, there's a setEmail function that exists, and now what we've done is we've made a function called random that takes in e, and it simply just calls setEmail with e. Like it's a pointless wrapper, but it demonstrates to you that like we're just giving the mutator an event, whereas like the email input should be allowed to specify what a value means to it, because that's the email input's job, right? The event and the clicking should be a bit of an abstraction in this case. So, well, how do we get around that? Well, this one's a little bit more difficult. And this is where JavaScript can get a little bit heady sometimes. But now what I'm going to say instead, and I'm actually going to abstract this out just because I think it'll be easier if you can all see it written down. So this is what we're currently giving it. We're giving it a function that takes in an event. I actually have to put this here, I think. We're giving it a function that takes in an event, and it calls update email on the index that it's looping through, and the value of that event. Now what happens if we want to capture the event here? If we want to capture the value? Well, that means that when I call the setEmail that I'm given, that I'm passed in, I'm going to, instead of giving it the event, I'd like to give it the e.target.value, which is the actual value. And what that means is that this wrapper here that I wrote, do email update, is now going to take in a value instead of the event. So now in theory this should work, I guess. Nope. Nope. So why does this not work here? Let's try console logging value. See what the child component is giving us. I didn't save the freaking file. My god. Alright. Let's try now. Okay, this works fine. And then you know, we don't need this to be written out all complicated. We could just write it out like this. So this, in my view, is an example of a perfectly written relationship between a parent and a child. We have a parent that manages everything it's concerned with. The entire list, the positions in the list, the updating of the list. And then we have an email input that is concerned with what it is, which is like, this is the value I'm printing. This is the function I'm told to give the value to when I update it. And this is the title of the field. I'll do the rest. It's also nice and reusable too, because you can now use this in any context. That was a very long answer. Hongtao, how do I transfer variables from one page or component to another? I'm going to assume that you're talking about when you click between things. That's going to be my guess. If you're moving between pages, like a user goes from one page and they links to another, probably the two ways to deal with that, either A, put it in local storage where you can access it from anywhere, or B, put put it in the URL. Like, that's all a URL is, really. Like, a URL is just like a variable. Like, when I'm on this website here and I click on browserify, it's not passing information between these pages, but it is through the URL, because when I click this, the new URL has different information in it, different variables in it, and those variables are used to load the page. So, like, one way is to put it in the URL, whereby, you know, you're basically throwing your data into the URL, and then when that page over there loads, as the next load, someone catches that, and then they load that. The other way is to use local storage, or some other kind of browser cache thing, where basically you can access that data on every single page. How to store data locally in React.js. There are two ways to do that. Both of them have lectures, so I'm not going to go through that now. But the first way is to go look at local storage. Kind of a simple, not super powerful, really quick to do. And then you'll have your use context. Bit more awkward to set up, a lot more powerful. Any other questions?